Hey everybody, Eric Dorward here with the Spartan Rocketry Club, and we are of course continuing our build of the Estes Black Brant XII here. Now it is time for attaching the fins. Now I am going to be using epoxy, so I am getting myself properly attired here in some gloves. By the way, in case you're curious, these are nitrile gloves. I found them at the supermarket. They look like so. You could certainly use latex gloves, but there's potential for allergen there. So nitrile gloves work just fine and they'll do the trick. These are disposable, obviously, once and done. Now, my goal here in this video is I'm going to attach all the fins like so. So the first thing I should really do is make sure that I can get them all in nicely so that I don't need to trim any of the cuts that I made earlier. They look fine. Some of them are a little stiffer than others, but that's okay. And yeah, that's going to fall out. That's fine. All right, so they look good. I've dry tested everything before I'm using the glue. Now, again, I'm going with my epoxy here. Let's get to it. This is, of course, binary glue, so you need 2 parts. And ooh, that was a lot. Oh, yeah, that just kind of came out like gangbusters there for a moment. And a reminder that you should probably be wearing some kind of glove when you do this, because epoxy can cause a reaction and it is cumulative over your lifetime. So something to be avoided. All right, so I've put approximately the same amount of my epoxy into my cup here. I'm stirring it up. Remember, this is the stuff I bought is 5-minute epoxy. That means I've got 5 minutes to work here before this ceases to be glue and instead becomes just like stinky plastic. All right, now the instructions say I only need to put glue on this tab. I am not actually going to follow that. I am going to put glue on the underside of this as if this were any other fin that I'm attaching. I'm going to try to get some along the side here too. That's going to be a little bit trickier. If you end up buying yourself a stick of epoxy, like a well, it wouldn't be pre-mixed, but epoxy in a tube, let's call it. This is actually a little easier to do. However, there are a lot of drawbacks to that, which I've discussed earlier. All right, so in this goes. Now, this stuff isn't going to just like start to get tacky like normal wood glue, because that's just not how it works. So I'm not going to worry too much about getting it completely set up how I want it. I am kind of facing a clock here, so I'm going to try to get all these fins glued and on the rocket, and then I'm going to worry about making sure that they're properly aligned. So, yeah, stuff, as members of my household can attest, this stuff stinks. But it's epoxy. It's not going to smell great. And it is the tool that we need for this job. So I kind of have to deal with that. All right. Next bit goes in. Notice this too is not really like stuck up where I want it to be either. So there's going to be a gap there. I don't love that, but I mean, it can't go in any farther because you can't see it, but it's pressing against the motor mount in there. So that's going to have to be filled in, and we will worry about that in a subsequent video. So continuing along with this, I am going to try to like squish it in place as well once I get all these on and I'm ready to start firmly anchoring everything. I seem to have done a reasonable job here of guesstimating the right amount of this stuff as well, which I'm rather pleased with. Okay. And yeah, this is pretty noxious. So I think what I'm ultimately going to do here is, because there is a bit of a gap, I'm going to use, typically I would just fill in the gap with glue, wood glue, and the instructions actually say that we should basically do that. However, I think I'm going to kill two birds with one stone. I'm not going to just use regular old glue to make the fillet. You should definitely have a fillet. I think I'm going to use another form of epoxy that I happen to have, and that would be epoxy clay. Now, epoxy clay is, well, as the name sounds, it's clay that has epoxy kind of impregnated into it. Actually, I don't want to put that in there. I'm basically done. So the clay, you mix it together. It's like it comes in a tube, so I'll show it at some point. But it basically, it has the strength of epoxy, or at least some of the strength of epoxy, and you have some playtime with it. And I'm gonna kind of roll it into a snake and go from there. All right, so I have all these in place. I have a couple minutes left before everything gets really permanent, so I very much need this to be accurate at this point. So the nice thing about having a grid mat like this is you can use it to line up the fins. I'm going to try to center things here on a set of grids, and you can see at least some of it here. And I just want to make sure that all the fins are in far enough, and that they are all at more or less right angles. And I can actually feel the epoxy starting to set, which is good. While there are definitely advantages to having a longer set time epoxy, this would be a case where you don't really want them. You wouldn't want like a 20-minute set here, because you'd be waiting just about forever for this thing to set up. All right. That looks reasonably good. It looks like, now there were supposed to be notches in the fin to kind of go over this bump. And while they certainly exist, they probably, the notches in the fin are okay at best. I mean, there's a lot of fin sticking out in most of these. I'm going to need a good amount of clay in order to fill in the gaps here. And I don't really think there's a whole lot I could have done differently here to avoid that fate. All right. Yeah, looking at it down here, I mean, there's a big gap right there. And there's a reasonable sized gap at the back too. I don't think there's much that I could do to address that. Now, the one that's nearest to me, this one has the biggest gap, and it might be that it was probably worth sanding down that the part that is interior to this, that is stuck up against the motor mount. So that, I mean, I guess I could have sanded it down a little bit, but ultimately, I don't think it would make a whole lot of difference. Again, right now, I just want to make sure that my fins are in as far as they can get, which I think is largely the case. And, as importantly, if not more importantly, that they are, straight. That is certainly not something I'm going to be able to fix after the fact. And I mean, they look reasonably good. If I have to fill in those holes a little bit afterwards, I can definitely do that. I'd rather not. But if they don't dry straight, that's a much bigger problem. All right. This one, nearest to me, is definitely the one that I am most concerned about. That one does seem to be the one that is farthest away from the rocket body. All right, that's probably about as good as that's going to get. Now, the next bit in the instructions calls for me to put fillets both next to the fin, which, I mean, I can probably pull that off with, well, this part here, I'm not going to do with just wood glue. I don't think that's going to help. I will break out the epoxy clay for that. But I also need to put fillets in the interior workings of this. However, I really don't want to do that until after the epoxy dries. And just as one last little thing that I think we should probably do in this video, there is a diagram that came with the kit. It's right here. And if you don't have a grid on a cutting board like I do, you could certainly use this thing to center, make sure all your fins are lined up right. The trick, of course, is that you have to get it nice and centered. I do not have it centered. It's close, but it was actually easier just using my grid fin, or my grid on my cutting mat. Anyway, that looks pretty good. I'm just going to leave it here. All right, so this, I guess, is going to be on the shorter side of the videos. I'm going to let the epoxy dry, and then maybe not in the next video, but in a subsequent video, we will deal with the gaps, and we will finish up the anchoring this on the motor mount. So I will see you soon.